Hello, John Lee. Welcome to StreetSmart Wisdom. It's a new conversation series we're doing with WisdomFeed and BetterListen. And I've been admiring your work for a long time now, and very excited to have this conversation. And maybe it's an introduction to people about you and your work. So what do you think some of the basic tenets or the basic themes in your work that have come to grow the body of work that you have over the years?
Well, let's start from the beginning, shall we? And my first book, The Flying Boy, Healing the Wounded Man, was really what got me started. And if it hadn't have happened, I wouldn't be talking to you today. I wrote that book in 1985 when I was 33 years old, and no one would publish it. It was a memoir of sorts about having grown up in an alcoholic home, dysfunctional home, father absent. And so I just told my story of losing a great love of my life and tried to make sense of my childhood, my adolescence, and my early adulthood. I was teaching college at the University of Texas and at Austin Community College, working on my doctorate. I couldn't finish it because I needed to write this book, The Flying Boy, Healing the Wounded Man. And nobody would publish it. Back then, you didn't write memoirs, or memoirs didn't get published by unknown people. They got published for politicians, sports figures, Hollywood figures, but just the pedestrian run-of-the-mill guy, everybody turned my book down. Luckily, we self-printed, it got picked up and got on Oprah 2 or 3 times, and it's a hard book to read, but it's still in print and still selling 30-something years later. And then I went on to write a second book called Flying Boy, The Journey Continues. And somehow I got sort of lumped in at the time with the beginning men's movement that Robert Bly and James Hillman and Michael Meade were facilitating in these late 80s. And then also the book got lumped into the recovery movement that was happening simultaneously, led by John Bradshaw, Janet Woititz, and all these people. So it was just the best timing in the world to get this book out and be sort of a focus for recovery and also for men at the same time. Subtitle of The Flying Boy was Why Men Run from Relationships. And that's what made it a pretty good seller for women.
Interesting. How did the whole Oprah thing happen?
Well, it was a kind of a miracle, Steve, like the rest of life is, if you look at it that way. People kept saying to me, oh, you got to get this book on Oprah. You got to get this book on Oprah. And we sent it and we tried and called. Nothing happened. And finally, one week, I told everybody that was involved with my staff, I said, listen, if it's meant to happen, it'll happen. Oprah called that week. Her friend, Gail, gave her a copy of it after having read it and said, Oprah, you need to read this book because Stedman is a flying boy. And so she read it and she had me on and she held up the book, and next week it was on the national bestseller list. And she had me on a couple more times. We got along really well. She's a wonderful woman. But again, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you if it wasn't for Oprah. The positive side of The Flying Boy and this is why so many women love flying boys, is flying boys tend to be very intuitive. They tend to be creative. They tend to be very smart, even if they're from Alabama, like myself. And so there's a great attraction to a beautiful man in flight who's also being creative and intuitive and and generous in some ways. So what my job in the book was to try to say, here's the downside of not being able to commit, but here's the upside of being creative and generative in a way. And now we just need to tone down the inability to commit and follow through in whatever kind of relationship that might be. So, it is still relevant. And I think that's why the Flying Boy is still selling 35 years later.